Hello, this is Chapter 10, Interviewing in Crisis Situations. So let's start by defining what a crisis is. A crisis is an event or situation or circumstance that provokes a strong reaction in a person. So, we could list some ideas of what crises are, but it'll also depend on what a person defines themselves as a crisis. A crisis may be a car accident, a crisis may be a death, a sudden death, a crisis might be a natural disaster. There's definitely a different scale of what a crisis may be to a person. There has been an increase in crisis services that you could refer with your clients, and that might be hotlines, rape crisis hotlines, shelters, home-based crisis teams. There's definitely a bigger variety of ways to deal with crisis situations. Something you might be asking yourself or thinking about, well, have you think about, is can a person in crisis bring strengths to the table? Absolutely, they can. The person in crisis is just like any other person that you're working with. You're going to build solutions the same way as you do with any other client. The main difference is that they're probably less likely able to work on forming goals at that particular time. And also they're going to probably want to spend more time talking about the problem. But the process is very similar for working with a person in crisis as it would be for working for any of the other clients that we've talked about previously. So the process for working with a person in crisis is mostly the same here. So I'm going to talk about what is the same. Your introduction will be the same things that you do in another session with another person will be the same for a crisis person. But there is a possibility you're going to get to the problem a lot quicker with a crisis person than with a voluntary or maybe even involuntary person. The same part with a crisis client is to listen carefully and affirm perceptions. Be empathetic with the person that you're working with. You might want to go more slowly here, and a good example of empathy was with Ensue on page 237. This was with Jermaine, who had been held at gunpoint for 3 days. Empathy is important, very, very important with a crisis person. The same question you're going to ask is, what have you tried? You're going to compliment them for what they have done or what they have tried. This is still the same. You're still going to ask them, what do you want to be different, or what have you done that has made it different for you? How do you want things to be? It still may sound dumb, but you're putting the ball in someone else's court, even if the crisis was out of their control. It will also tell you if they can work on goal formulation if they're ready for that yet. Using the miracle question may be optional. That might be the only difference in this solution building with crisis clients, is whether or not they're ready for the miracle question. You could use the miracle question if the person has some energy and some hope, but if they cannot do this, you might want to refer to coping questions. And there's a cheat sheet on page 404 about the coping questions. The rest of the session is going to be the same as well. You're still going to take your break. You're still going to formulate feedback. Everything will still look the same, but you're just kind of maybe showing more empathy here, and you're getting to the problem a little quicker. Now, what if you have a hopeless and overwhelmed person that comes to your office? Well, the hopeless and overwhelmed person is caught up in their own suffering. They're feeling totally helpless to change or thinking differently at all. So you do not focus on goals or use the miracle question with this type of person, because they can't think that. That's too complex for where they're at right now. You're going to use the coping questions instead, page 232 to 233. The focusing on coping efforts. What have you found helpful so far? How did you make it here? Get up this morning and take care of yourself with everything that's going on. Could it be worse? Who would be helpful to you? Then scale the coping ability and success and progress with your client. There is an example on page 235 of scaling how well Jim was coping now. If the person remains overwhelmed and hopeless, they may need more drastic measures like medication or hospitalization if we can't get them to kind of calm down. You may have to consult your supervisor or whatever your agency's policy is for working with someone in this state. The solution building dialogue will have been helpful because the person will see that their strengths are not sufficient at this point to overcome this helplessness or hopelessness. If you're working with a suicidal person, don't try to persuade them that suicide is illogical or will hurt other people. That will create more distance between you and that person because, again, in their mindset, they're thinking that that's their only way out or that is the answer to their problems. But you more or less want to find the logic of the choice that they're making. Explore more of, well, why do you think suicide is the option for you? Again, not using a why question, but that's mainly what you're trying to figure out without asking why. How do they make sense of it? How do we do this? You're going to do that not knowing, the curiosity. Don't minimize the person who is suicidal and don't disbelieve that they won't commit suicide. That's something that you don't want to do when you're working with them. Drastic solutions may not be necessary. They may not necessarily need hospitalization just because they're feeling suicidal, but it's not off the table. Instead, look for the other side of hopelessness by asking coping questions. Suicide is a form of being overwhelmed. So back to the overwhelmed person that we just talked about before. Respect their perception that they're coming from. Respect their hopelessness. Invite them to talk about how they are coping with it now. And, maybe you could build off of that. Well, you are doing some form of coping, so maybe suicide doesn't have to be the answer or the option. You want to ask them, how often do you have these thoughts? If they say 95% of the time, focus on what they're doing the other 5% of the time. How come things are not worse for them? Ask them that question. It will help take you to the next step. Some additional scaling questions might be on motivation and hope if you're working with a suicidal person, and how confident they are that they will be able to find ways to kind of cope with their situation aside from doing their initial choice of wanting to commit suicide. So that is just a little bit about working on crisis situations with clients and try and help them see those solutions or helping them deal with their immediate situation. Very short lecture video for this chapter. So thank you for watching, and we'll move on to chapter 11.